Hello and welcome to the fourth video podcast in Humanities and Western Civilization. This week we are examining the ancient Romans. The Romans were the inheritors and the conquerors of the Greek world. Although Rome would one day become the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, it began as just a small settlement on the Tiber River in Italy. Over time, the Romans would expand outward, propelled by the might of their legions, and bring their language, law, and culture to the rest of the Western world. It cannot be underestimated how important the legacy of Rome is to our world. Our laws, languages, and cultures have been shaped by it. In today's lesson, we will look at Rome from its earliest beginnings as a republic. We'll see it eventually reinvent itself as a huge empire. In the next unit, we will see how the Roman Empire eventually crumbles and falls, but today we will be looking at it during its zenith. The learning outcomes for this unit are: number 1, understand the legacy of the Roman Empire for the West. Describe the Roman Republic and the expansion of Rome. Explain the reasons for the shift from a republic to an imperial political state. This is a map of modern Europe with the current borders outlined. In this module, with our discussions on ancient Greece and Rome, we have begun to focus more closely on Europe itself. However, it is very important to remember that none of these modern countries existed in the past, which we are focusing on now. Whole peoples and languages had yet to migrate into the area. The place names would have been completely different. In fact, even when we reach the Middle Ages, most of these countries still won't exist yet. Now, in some instances, we can see early shadows of these future countries, but most don't exist in any form. In this image, you see the Roman Empire at its height. The first thing you have to notice is just how big it was. It was massive. The Roman Empire at its height covered nearly the entirety of Europe, some 3.5 million square miles, with over 50 million people estimated to have lived in it. It stretched from Scotland to North Africa. It included most of the Middle East, Anatolia, and even parts of Eastern Europe. This was the largest empire the ancient world would ever see, and it is really quite remarkable that the Romans were able to manage this in the absence of modern forms of communication. Wherever the Romans went, they brought their culture, laws, and language. This has resulted in a noticeable divide in Europe today. Two areas, one in which the Roman Empire touched, and the area outside that they did not touch. Some people call it the olive oil butter divide. The idea is that on one side of the divide, the Roman one, olive oil tended to be the fat used in cooking. On the other side, it was butter. Now, I prefer the wine-beer divide. On one side, the Roman one, wine tended to be the preferred alcoholic drink, and on the other side, it was beer. So how did the Romans control such a vast empire? One way was with roads. The Romans were great road builders. The network of public Roman roads covered over 120,000 kilometers, and it greatly assisted the free movement of armies, people, and goods across the empire. Roads were also a very visible indicator of the power of Rome, and they indirectly helped unify what was a vast melting pot of cultures, races, and institutions. Many of the Roman roads underlie the modern network of highways, which crisscross Europe and the Middle East today. Roman roads were the main arteries of the empire. Many roads in Italy still use the original Roman name for certain stretches, and even some bridges, such as the Tre Ponti in modern Fatti, still carry road traffic today. Roman roads connected communities, cities, and provinces, and without them, the Romans could not have conquered and held on to the vast territories they did over so many centuries. No matter where you went in the empire, you found towns, cities, and infrastructure identical to the rest of the empire. Each Roman town became a carbon copy of the others. Here you see an artist's imagining of the Roman city of Londinium, which we know today as London, England. Roman cities were islands that spread Roman culture to the countryside. Whether you were in the far north of the empire in Londinium, or in a Roman African city like Carthage, you could expect to find a public bath with hot water, indoor plumbing, and steam rooms. You could take in entertainment at the local amphitheater, watch gladiators fight or animals. These are the well-preserved remains of a Roman amphitheater in Tunisia in North Africa, but at one time similar buildings would have existed throughout the empire. At the outer fringes of the empire, Rome built defenses. Here you see the remains of Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall was famously ordered to be built in the early 2nd century by Emperor Hadrian. Originally, it would have stood 3 meters wide and 5 to 6 meters high. Now today the remains are obviously smaller, but the engineering feat is no less impressive. Stretching 73 miles across North Britain from coast to coast, Hadrian's Wall was built to guard the wild northwest frontier of the Roman Empire. Outside the Roman Empire, many other peoples wanted in. Over time, many of these tribes, Germanic tribes, Celtic tribes, became Romanized as they were conquered. In fact, the Roman Empire was made up of a multi-ethnic and multicultural mix of Germans, Celts, Italians, Grecians, North Africans, and other peoples. Perhaps the most obvious legacy of the Romans is their language. The Romans spoke Latin. Their alphabet looks very familiar to you. This inscription is nearly 2,000 years old, and yet I bet you can read the letters just fine. Across the top it reads, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. The Romans inherited their alphabet from the Greeks, who had in turn adopted it from the Phoenicians. It is, in fact, our alphabet today. Wherever the Romans conquered, they brought their language. It quickly established itself as a language of business and government. If you wanted to do business with Rome, you needed to do it in Latin. If you wanted to live in the Roman Empire, you also needed to speak Latin. The languages of the conquered slowly disappeared. In fact, originally much of mainland Europe was dominated by the Celtic culture and languages. For example, the Romans called the area, which is now roughly modern-day France, Gaul, after the Gaulish Celtic people. Over time, however, the Celtic languages all but disappeared to be replaced by Latin. Only on the edges of the empire, in what is now modern-day Ireland and in Scotland, would Celtic remain in the form of Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic. When the Roman Empire eventually disappeared, its languages remained. Over time, the Latin that was spoken in the area of Italy began to become different than the Latin that was spoken in what will one day be called France, and what was spoken in what will one day be Spain and Portugal. Latin would eventually change into what we would one day call Romance languages. Languages such as French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are all modern versions of Latin, a living legacy to the long-disappeared Roman Empire. Today, over 1 billion people on the planet speak a modern form of Latin. Everywhere you see which is orange or yellow is where a Romance language is an official language or national secondary language. Now you might be wondering, why do we actually call Romance languages Romance languages? Is it because they are more romantic than others? Well, it is true that our word romance does indeed relate to love, and it has, in fact, the same etymological origin as Romance languages. In the Middle Ages, a particular form of writing became popular in the courts of Europe. They were tales written about chivalry and love, about handsome and brave knights and beautiful princesses. The tales about an imaginary King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table are also part of this genre. These stories were called romances, and they were shared amongst the literate nobility in the courts of Europe. The reason why they are called romances, however, has nothing to do with love. These stories were written in an early form of the French language, which, as it was a living form of Latin, people simply referred to it as the Romans language. "Tell us another tale in the Romans language," they would say. This was the spoken everyday French which people conversed in. Since these stories were about love, the association of romance with love was cemented. We can also see the legacy of the Latin language in how modern languages have changed. We can hear echoes of the Romans in our own speech. Latin was originally pronounced very differently compared to how its descendants, the Romance languages, are pronounced today. For example, in Latin, the letter C would have been pronounced hard, almost like a K. Thus, the great Roman leader, Caesar, would have actually been pronounced more like Kaiser. Moreover, J's were pronounced as Y's. So to pronounce his name the way he would have said it, you would call him Julius Caesar. After Caesar died, future Roman emperors took his name as a title of sorts. Thus, all Roman emperors were referred to as Caesar. Gradually, over the past 2,000 years, the C in Romance languages began to soften. So slowly, Kaiser became Caesar. However, the memory of how the name was pronounced is kept alive in the names of kings. In Germany, for example, when Germany had a king, he was referred to as a Kaiser. And in Russia, the king is referred to as the Tsar. Both of these are simply adoptions of the Roman title for leader, Kaiser. When Caesar sent a letter to the Roman Senate around 47 BC, after he had achieved a quick victory in his short war against Pharnaces II of Pontus at the Battle of Zela, he wrote just 3 short Latin words: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But if we're pronouncing it the way he would have said it, then we should say Veni, vidi, vici. The letter V in classical Latin was actually pronounced more like a W. We can see the legacy for this in the word for wine. For example, the Latin word for wine was vinum. However, gradually over time in Latin's descendants, the V started to be pronounced the way we pronounce V's. So the word for wine in French is vin. In Spanish and in Italian, it is vino. Now, when the ancient Germanic tribes first encountered the Romans, they had no word for wine. These were northern German peoples, beer drinkers. So they adopted the Roman word for their new alcoholic beverage, and they pronounced it just the way the Romans would, with a W sound. So in English today, we say wine, and in German, it's Wein. The ancient Latin is preserved for us in our speech. Another important legacy of the Roman Empire today is law. The Romans were great lawmakers. Over the period of the Roman Empire, the Romans codified a set of laws which would eventually become the basis of much of the world's law systems today. Referred to as Roman civil law, the code set down the basic rules of property and legal procedures. The law codes are the basis of laws in France, Italy, Spain, and many other places. Now, in English-speaking lands, a different type of law code became the norm, inherited from the Anglo-Saxons. Our laws are based on English common law. This ancient code, along with the Roman codes, provides the backbone for nearly every single legal system today. In this map, you can see the distribution of legal systems around the world. Most of the world follows the Roman code, while places where the British Empire touched, you can see English common law predominant. Nowhere is this contrast as clear than in our own country of Canada. In Canada, if you wish to be a lawyer and practice in every province, you would actually need to be called to the bar twice. Once for English Canada, which is under common law, and once for French Canada, which is under Roman civil law. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. How did the Roman Empire come to be? How did they come to have such a profound influence on the modern world today? Rome began as a small settlement on the Tiber River, which is midway up the Italian peninsula on the Mediterranean. From there it would spread to grow to cover the vast area of the Roman Empire. Now, normally Roman history is divided up into 3 periods. The earliest phase, which is the one that we know the least about, is the monarchy and Etruscan period. This was followed by the Republic, a period in which the Romans deposed their king and began an experiment in a democracy-like government structure, the Republic. Under the Republic, Rome was ruled by the Senate, a governmental body made up of predominantly aristocrats. Finally, Rome enters its imperial phase, the age of emperors, the Roman Empire. During the earliest period of Roman history, Rome actually shared the Italian peninsula with another civilization, the Etruscans. The Etruscan civilization flourished in central Italy between the 8th and 3rd century BCE. However, much of its culture and even history was either obliterated or assimilated into that of its conqueror, Rome. Nevertheless, surviving Etruscan tombs, their contents, and their wall paintings, as well as the Roman adoption of certain Etruscan clothing, religious practices, and architecture, are convincing testaments to the great prosperity and significant contribution to Mediterranean culture achieved by Italy's first great civilization. This Etruscan wall painting shows a married couple at a banquet. The style of the figures is derived from Greek art, but the depiction of a husband and wife dining on the same couch is characteristically Etruscan. The city of Rome was founded sometime in the 8th century BCE. The site of the founding of the city of Rome, which would eventually become the capital of the Republic and eventually then the Empire, had a ford where one could cross the river Tiber in central Italy. The Palatine hills surrounding it provided easily defensible positions in the wide, fertile plain surrounding them. Each of these features contributed to the success of the city. There are several myths about the founding of Rome. The Romans themselves loved to mythologize their beginnings. One of the legends has the city founded by two brothers who had been abandoned at birth, but rescued and nursed to health by a she-wolf. Here you see the Capitoline wolf, a sculpture of the she-wolf feeding the twins Romulus and Remus, the most famous image associated with the founding of Rome. It was actually long a mystery when the sculpture was actually created, but recent evidence suggests that it dates from a much later period, in fact the Middle Ages. According to another legend that was popular amongst the Romans, the founding of Rome was related to the Greeks. According to this story, the Trojan prince Aeneas, who was fleeing from the Trojan War, reached the Italian coast and married a woman named Lavinia, and founded the city of Rome. Now, the myth of Aeneas gave Rome a divine and Greek founding. Sadly, this one doesn't look like it could be possible because Troy was destroyed somewhere around 1200 BCE, which was centuries before Rome was founded. So Aeneas would have had to have been sailing around quite some time in the Mediterranean before he reached Italy, like hundreds of years. But anyway, it's still a really nice story. Regardless of how Rome was founded, in its early history it was ruled by kings. According to tradition, there were 7 kings of Rome, the last of which was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, who died in 495 BCE. Tarquinius was the legendary 7th and final king of Rome, and he reigned from 535 BCE until a popular uprising in 509 BC, which led to the establishment of the Roman Republic. He is commonly referred to as Tarquin the Proud from his name Superbus, which is Latin for proud or arrogant or lofty. Tarquin's reign is remembered for his use of violence and intimidation to control Rome and his disrespect of Roman custom. Eventually, Tarquin's conduct led to a revolution that deposed him and expelled him and his family from Rome in 509 BCE, and thus Rome entered into its second phase of history, the Republic. The Roman Republic was a government that in theory, if not always in practice, represented the wishes of its citizens. The word itself is composed of 2 Latin words, res, meaning thing, and publica, meaning the people. Thus, the Republic, res publica, was a people's affair. During the Republican period of Rome, political offices and institutions were designed to prevent any one man from becoming too powerful. The Romans replaced the king with 2 consuls, rulers who had many of the same powers of the king, but were elected to serve 1-year terms. Each consul could veto or reject the actions of the other consul. The consuls were responsible to the Senate. The Romans used the name senatus, or senate, for their most important seat of government, which derives from senex, meaning old, and meant an assembly of old men with the connotation of wisdom and experience. Members were sometimes referred to as fathers or patres. And so this combination of ideas illustrates that the Senate was a body designed to provide reasoned and balanced guidance to the Roman state and its people. One of the most common phrases you will see carved into ancient Roman columns and walls are the letters S, P, Q, R. They stand for Senatus Populusque Romanus. This phrase, more than anything, summarized the Roman ideal of governments and service, the Senate and people of Rome. By around 265 BCE, Rome had grown to control a patchwork of conquered territory, colonies, and allied states in Italy, held together by a network of treaties and roads. The beginnings of its later empire had been sown. Now, all of this was made possible by the Roman army. The Roman army with its legions was arguably one of the longest surviving and most effective fighting forces in military history. One of the main reasons Rome became so powerful was because of the strength of its army. The Roman army was the backbone of Rome's power. It was also the source of Rome's economic and political strength. The army was also a tool of cultural assimilation. Serving in the Roman army meant leaving one's home for decades. Some soldiers were away from their families for long periods of time, loosening their clan loyalties and replacing them with loyalty to Rome. The Roman army was a means by which foreigners or barbarians could become citizens. But the process was not fast. Only when a soldier had served in the army for 25 years could he become a citizen of Rome. Roman society was essentially divided into three groups, although over time the distinctions between them lessened to be replaced by simply those with means and those without. The most powerful group in society were the patricians. Patricians were the elite class of Rome. Sitting at the top of Roman society were the emperor and the patrician classes. They enjoyed fabulous wealth, power, and privilege. The patricians were the rich landowners. They would often have a house in the city and a villa in the country, which was run by slaves. Plebeians were the free Roman citizens who were not members of the patrician classes. They were the average working citizens of Rome, farmers, bakers, builders, or craftsmen who worked hard to support their families and pay their taxes. At the lowest rung of society were the slaves. Most slaves during the Roman Empire were foreigners, and unlike modern times, Roman slavery was not based on race. Slaves in Rome might include prisoners of war, sailors captured and sold by pirates, or slaves bought outside Roman territory. You could also descend into slavery due to your debts. All slaves and their families were the property of their owners, who could sell them or rent them out at any time. Their lives were harsh. Slaves were often whipped, branded, or cruelly mistreated. Their owners could also kill them for any reason and would face no punishment. Slavery was an ever-present feature of the Roman world. Slaves served in households, agriculture, mines, the military, manufacturing workshops, construction, and a wide range of services within the city. As many as 1 in 3 of the population of Italy, or 1 in 5 across the empire, were slaves, and upon the foundation of forced labor was built the entire edifice of Roman state and society. As Rome expanded, it inevitably came into conflict with other civilizations in the Mediterranean. The greatest of its early rivals was Carthage. The city of Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians, a civilization that we talked about in the last module. Originally a small port on the coast, established only as a stop for Phoenician traders to resupply or repair their ships, Carthage would eventually grow to become the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean before the rise of Rome. Here you can see that the Carthage Empire covers most of North Africa and part of what is now modern-day Spain. Here you see an example of Carthaginian craftsmanship. These pendants of male heads were made of colored glass and came from Carthage. The Phoenicians and their colonists excelled in glasswork as a medium for the production of luxury goods. As the empires of Carthage and Rome continued to grow, it wasn't long before they came into conflict. When Carthage conquered the island of Sicily, Rome finally responded. This is Sicily right here. Although Rome had no navy and knew nothing of fighting on the sea, Rome built 330 ships which they equipped with clever ramps and gangways, which could then be lowered onto an enemy ship and secured. Thus, the Romans were able to turn a sea battle into something that they had the advantage in, a land battle. The First Punic War, which is what the wars between Carthage and Rome became known as, lasted nearly 20 years. At the end, in nearly 241 BCE, Rome finally defeated Carthage. It would be the first of many defeats for Carthage. 2 more Punic Wars would follow between Carthage and Rome. The Second Punic War saw the Carthaginian general and statesman Hannibal and his troops, including as many as 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and a number of elephants, march from Spain across the Alps and into Italy as a massive flanking maneuver. However, after a string of defeats, the Romans finally managed to rebound and push the Carthaginians out of Italy as Rome won victories in Spain and North Africa under a rising young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later become known as Scipio Africanus. In 203 BCE, Hannibal's forces were forced to abandon the struggle in Italy in order to defend their home in North Africa, and in the following year, Scipio's army finally defeated the Carthaginians at Zama. Hannibal's losses in the Second Punic War effectively put an end to Carthage's empire in the western Mediterranean, leaving Rome in full control of Spain, allowing Carthage only to retain its territory in North Africa. At the end of the Second Punic War, Rome imposed harsh terms. They seized the overseas possessions of Carthage and dismantled its navy. Then finally, in 149 BCE, Romans started a Third Punic War, which actually destroyed the city of Carthage. With their greatest rival now defeated, Rome was free to expand even further. By 100 BCE, the Roman Republic had added all the territory that you see in orange. Yet at the same time, the Roman Republic was beginning to reach its limits. Cracks had begun to show. The Roman Republic began to decline around 133 BCE and eventually collapsed in 27 BCE. Now, there are many reasons why the Republic began to have trouble in its later years. However, at its heart was a growing inequality between rich and poor. The numerous conquests that the Republic had produced had brought with it a never-ending stream of wealth which was flowing into the center. The conquered lands made some in Rome very wealthy, but it also increased the huge disparity between rich and poor, as these proceeds were not distributed equally at all. Now, some Romans tried to change things. In 134 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus, a politician of the Roman Republic, tried to make radical changes. Now, while Gracchus belonged to the highest aristocracy, he actually tried to help the poor. He was elected as plebeian tribune, which was a leader of sorts over the poorer classes. He caused complete turmoil in the Republic when he tried to pass laws which would transfer land from the wealthy, predominantly noble landowners, to poorer citizens. In the end, he was murdered, along with many of his supporters, by members of the Roman Senate and supporters of the conservative Optimates faction. It was the beginning of a century of civil war and turmoil for the Roman Republic. Indeed, in the turmoil of the last century of the Republic, even the slaves revolted. Spartacus, a gladiator and slave, led a slave revolt with an army numbering in tens of thousands. He defeated Roman forces over a half-dozen times, marching his people up and down the Italian peninsula until he was killed in a battle in April of 71 BCE. 6,000 survivors of his revolt were captured by the legions and crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua. The final stage of the Republic was Julius Caesar. Caesar was an ambitious Roman general and politician who sought to expand Rome and bring glory to himself. He was following in the footsteps of other ambitious Roman politicians who had led foreign conquests as a way to bolster their reputations at home. Slowly but surely, however, Caesar's exploits brought him power and wealth. In 58 BCE, Julius Caesar took control of Rome's northern frontier and set out to conquer Gaul, which corresponds roughly to modern-day France. However, back at home, many more enemies in the Senate were appearing for him. As his enemies back in Rome grew more powerful, Julius Caesar faced a critical choice. To remain in Gaul, where he was fighting with his army, meant forfeiting his power to his enemies in Rome. However, if he brought his army into Rome, that would be a declaration of war. In 49 BCE, Caesar chose war. He took the fateful step of crossing the Rubicon, the river which marked the northern border of Italy, with his army. This one act would trigger the civil war, which would destroy the Roman Republic. In the short term, Caesar was victorious and had himself established as dictator for life. However, his victory was short-lived. In 44 BCE, Caesar was famously stabbed to death on the floor of the Senate. Following the death of Caesar, many others fought it out for power in a series of coups and civil wars. Now, the last man standing in 31 BCE, when it was all over, was this guy, Octavian, the adopted son and heir of Caesar. It is he who became Rome's first emperor. Taking the name Augustus, Octavian would begin a tradition that all Roman emperors would follow. On his death, the name Caesar Augustus became an official title of Roman emperors thereafter. With his rivals defeated and the military's backing, Augustus restored order and the rule of law to Rome. From this point onward, Rome would always be led by an emperor, who is known as a princeps or first citizen. In the short term, the beginning of the empire was a time of peace and order, a pax romana, a Roman peace descended over much of Europe. At the same time, the last vestige of the Republic, the Senate, saw its power greatly reduced. Augustus and his successors embarked on a massive building program, producing propaganda and art. All of this production ultimately resulted in a golden age of Roman art and literature. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire would include Britain, parts of Scotland, and much of Germany. All of North Africa, including Egypt, the Holy Land, the Middle East, and Anatolia. For the next 3 centuries, the Roman Empire would impose its culture and language over millions of people. In the next unit, we'll see how it all comes to an end.